It's a real battle around AI. Is America going to lead? Is China going to lead?
Welcome to Direct with John Delaney, sponsored by Forbright Bank. On this show, we talk about entrepreneurship, leadership, building businesses, public policy, investing, financial services, all the things that we all care about. Today, we have a terrific guest, Steve Case, the founder and CEO of America Online, one of the most important technology companies in this country's history. If you made a list of the most iconic, most significant leaders in the history of kind of the technology business in this country, Steve Case would absolutely have to be at the top of that list. But he's done much more than even that. He founded a venture and investment fund called Revolution, which is invested in some terrific companies like DraftKings, Tempest, CAVA, the fast casual restaurant many of us enjoy so much, Clear, the company we all see at the airport. Steve's behind all these businesses. He's been active in public policy. He's been an advisor to presidents. He helped pass the Jobs Act, which has been an incredibly important piece of legislation to allow companies to go public more easily. He lives here in Washington, so he kind of exists at the intersection of public policy, investing, and technology. So we're really excited to have my friend Steve Case.
Great to be with you, John.
So you wrote two terrific books, The Rise of the Rest and The Third Wave. But The Rise of the Rest, you talked about how, in many ways, America was the most successful and perhaps the first startup ever. And you framed it around the 250th anniversary of our country, which is obviously coming up this year. We're clearly not a startup any longer. And we're going to this next phase, and there's a lot happening in business and how it's changing our world. So just give me your perspectives on that.
It's a tough question. I wrote that probably 5 years ago after spending a number of years traveling around the country, partly doing some of the work around Rise of the Rest and talking about the role of startups and how they create jobs and drive economic growth and things like that. And I realized as I was traveling around that America itself was a startup. It really was 250 years ago, just an idea. And like many startups, most people around the world were skeptical that the idea of America would ever, survive. And for a while, it looked like they were right. As you know, the early years were a little bit chaotic and kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but kind of made it through that. And then fast forward, 250 years, this little fragile startup turns into the leader of the pack, the most powerful country, the leading economy. And so part of this is how do we make sure we continue to build on that track record and think about what got us to now and not get, kind of cocky or complacent. So part of that writing was sort of hoping that we all do use this opportunity, this summer with the 250th to take a step back, reflect, celebrate what got us here, acknowledge some of the challenges we face both within this country and around the world, and kind of redouble our efforts to continue to be the leader and to make sure the next 250 years, are great ones. And so, obviously, there's a lot to celebrate around this country, including the work of innovation, entrepreneurship. That is why we have the leading economy. It wasn't an accident. We just ended up leading the way in the agricultural revolution and then leading the way in the industrial revolution and leading the way in the technology kind of digital revolution. And that's why we are, the leading economy. And because we have the leading economy, as you all know, that's, it's a key reason why we're the leader of the free world and such a powerful nation. So, and I hope as we all come together, and hopefully we will come together, this summer, because obviously things are rather fragile and there's a lot of kind of tension and hyper partisanship. Hopefully we'll be able to come together and be reflective on what got us to now. And as I said, redouble our efforts to make sure that the next chapter of America is a bright one.
It's such a good message for our leaders, not only in business, but in politics, what you just said. I mean, I often think people don't put what we've really accomplished here in the proper context or how we've been able to do it. And if you think about the challenges we have today, which you went through a few of them, in the context of the challenges we've overcome historically, in many ways, they're not that difficult. if you think about some of the things you talked about, the early years of the country were incredibly challenging. The Civil War, the two world wars, the kind of things that the U.S. was able to endure and in many ways show global leadership in. Our challenges today seem manageable, except for what you referenced, which is how divided we are. But one of the things I do think we have in common is this notion that the entire country has to prosper. It's something that you've been a leader, really by any measure of anyone in the private sector, thinking about ensuring economic opportunity is spread all around the country. And the thing that's on everyone's mind is obviously the impact of artificial intelligence. And you were around and were one of the key architects of the greatest, maybe technological innovation any of us have ever seen in our lifetime, which was the internet. As the founder and CEO of AOL, you really created the modern internet in terms of how many of us still engage with it. So how do you think about AI? Because there's people who say it's going to completely change everything. We're going to lose all these jobs. The country's not prepared for it, and other people think of it more in the context of a continuing wave of innovation that will change things, but will kind of fold into our day-to-day lives like all innovation has done.
Well, it's a little bit of a mix. I think AI for sure is a transformative technology that already started to have impact, and that will accelerate in the coming decades. And it will disrupt a lot of things, will destroy a lot of jobs. The question is, are we able to use AI and other technologies to reimagine things in terms of how healthcare works, or education works, or other sectors work, to create some new jobs to make up for the jobs that are lost. And that's why the role of startups is so important, and the role of doing that in a more evenly across the country ways. It's also interesting because you look at the history of AI, it first was developed and even talked about nearly 75 years ago. It's not particularly new technology. It's been developing over decades. And there have been a lot of enterprise applications and even consumer applications in the last decade. Most of the apps we all use on our smartphones have AI built in and have for many years. The AI revolution really came with the success, really the overnight success about 3 years ago of ChatGPT, which kind of came onto the scene, and there was something like 100 million users after the first several months. And people say, wow, this is incredible what these platforms can do. That's led to this accelerated interest, a dramatic acceleration of investment in it. And as a result, you're seeing the pace of innovation in AI really accelerate, and the impact it can have on different sectors in terms of how you operate things in a smarter way. The impact is only now being felt, and it's going to take several decades, just as it did with the internet, for that to roll forward. And it'll be a mixed bag, just like the internet. There are a lot of great things about the internet that have really kind of changed society, changed the economy in fundamental ways, and mostly positive ways. But there have also been some negatives associated with it as well. The same will be true with AI. And I think the challenge for all of us, whether we're on the entrepreneur side or the investor side or the policymaking side, is how do we maximize the benefits of these new technologies, these new platforms like AI, and minimize, sort of hedge against some of the risk. But for sure, it's going to be a mixed bag. Even going back to farming and in the agricultural revolution, we now think back and it's remarkable that we went from most of us working on farms to only now 1 or 2% of us working on farms. And that was because of technology making it easier to grow more food in a more productive way with a lot fewer people. That was in some ways, kind of a devastating threat to an economy, which at the time was essentially an agriculture economy. But as a nation, we were able to make this pivot from farming to factories and retraining people, and kind of went from that, as I said, the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution. The same dynamic it was going to be present with any new technology. It's going to have some impact that's direct, a lot of other impacts that are indirect. Some of the direct ones are more obvious to see, easier to see. Some of the indirect impact take a little longer to see. And it's just, you've got to be in front of it. You got to make sure that you're leading the charge, including going back to sort of the global competitiveness issues, countries like China are really getting very serious about technology innovation, have led the way in some energy areas like solar, led the way in electric vehicles. It's a real battle around AI. Is America going to lead? Is China going to lead? So America needs to lead, but we need to do it in a way that's thoughtful about some of the benefits it can bring, but also some of the challenge and risk associated with it.
I mean, we do have, I mean, at least from my perspective, and I'd love your insight of this, we really do have the leading AI companies. We're doing pretty darn well. But do you share that perspective?
I mostly share that perspective. I would say that the United States definitely leads in terms of the current leading AI companies. Most of them are based in the United States. Interestingly, many of them are our leading tech giants who are just leveraging their platforms to get even bigger. Google, for example, or many other examples. There are some startups that have emerged, OpenAI, Anthropic, some others that have become very significant players, fairly quickly. But it's a little bit big tech getting bigger, as well as some new entrants emerging. And America has always been stronger in terms of that entrepreneurial economy, launching new companies than China and other countries. Same time, if you look at the core technologies, if you talk to AI researchers, they do think it's a closer battle. But some of the things that are happening in China are keeping pace. We're probably ahead a little bit, but not that much. Maybe it's months, not years, certainly not decades. So I think we have continued to be better at the creation of new companies that help commercialize these new technologies. But I think it's a closer battle in terms of the core technology that's underlying these platforms. Which is, again, we should be optimistic and about America's lead and continue to build on that. But I think we're in like the bottom of the first inning of the AI battle, and right now we're ahead, at least by a little bit, maybe by a lot. But there's a lot of innings to play.
And one of the things that, like, even at Forbright, we're trying to figure this out as we look to finance some of the AI infrastructure, mostly data centers, things like that. The commitments that the big technology companies in the United States have made are so extraordinary in terms of, forward commitments to purchase capacity in AI infrastructure and data centers. I think everyone's trying to figure out, have they gotten ahead of themselves? Is there a lot of exposure? Even some of these, even for companies with $2, $3, $4 trillion market capitalizations, which, by the way, is just hard to imagine that. I mean, when you ran AOL, it was probably the most valuable company in the country. And what was its market capitalization? 100 billion.
Yeah, we went public with 70 million in 1992. And then 8 years later, we did the merger with AOL, with Time Warner and AOL. It was something like 160 billion. So at the time, 160 billion seemed big, but now Anthropic, OpenAI, the new companies, let alone the giants, are hundreds of billions, if not several trillion.
But these market capitalization numbers are hard to get your head around. But what's not hard to get your head around is the sheer dollars that they're committing. 600 billion, 800 billion of actual commitments to future investments in AI infrastructure. Do you think they're getting ahead of themselves, or do you think this is the game they need to be playing?
Could be both. I think it's the game they need to be playing. This is like a kind of a gold rush mentality. You don't want to. The AI is so important. You have to lead, and you've got to put all the chips on the table to make sure you're making all the investments you could be making in terms of capital investments, attracting talent, partnerships, acquisitions, whatever it might be. Every big company knows that this is their future, and they have to lead. As a result, of course, they're making massive investments. Some of them are not going to pay off, and some of the companies with high valuations are going to go to zero. It's always the nature of this. Even with the internet boom 25 years ago, there are some companies that succeeded, some companies didn't. There was a massive build out of infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, fiber, things like that. And some of those investments paid off. A lot of them didn't. And I have no doubt we are in a similar dynamic here. But I don't fault the companies for, the big companies for kind of going all in and making these massive investments, because they don't want to be in second place here. They really want to be in a leadership position. But it is tricky because some of these data centers that are being built probably are going to get, right now it feels like no matter how quickly you can build, it's all going to be sucked up by the surging demand. And that may be true for a while, but at some point there likely will be a hiccup.
Yeah, because and again, I think everyone's trying to get our head around it. But to your point, it's been beneficial to the economy. I mean, I was talking about to an electrician the other day because, as you know, my dad was an electrician, and it's never been better to be an electrician, right? Like they can't get enough of these people, and these things are being built all around the country. We're seeing whole new kind of towns get built in parts of Texas, which kind of brings us back to one of your life's passions, which is to make sure entrepreneurship and investment flows not just to a handful of cities. I remember hearing this statistic first from you back when I was in Congress, where you said something like 75 or 80% of venture capital was flowing to three places in the country. Northern California, New York, and Boston. And I think that was certainly an eye-opening statistic for me, and it put into perspective kind of the lack of economic opportunity. If you view economic opportunity as somewhat correlated to the startup ecosystem, which I certainly believe it is, how unfair it is. And you've started a whole initiative. You wrote a book, Rise of the Rest. You've got an investment platform that invests in other cities. So are you an optimist that it does finally create an opportunity for other parts of the country to benefit from the kind of startup ecosystem that the big three have seen for now, several decades?
I am an optimist. I think we've made progress the last decade, but still a lot of work to be done for sure. And I say with these AI companies we've talked about, a lot of them are based in Silicon Valley, so it shows the strength of that ecosystem. But I think the next phase of AI is going to shift from these LLMs, these platforms, to more vertical AI, where AI is being used to reimagine specific industries, and that's where it likely can spread more broadly across the country. But matching the opportunities with capital and talent is where the kind of the rubber meets the road. So the jury is out, but I do believe more people now realize that things are happening in different parts of the country. You saw with the early phases of COVID, some people moving to other cities. Some people did that temporarily, then moved back. A lot of people stayed there. You're even seeing now some entrepreneurs in California leaving California in part because of policy, tax reasons, and going to other cities. So it's starting to be more broadly distributed, still dominated by a few places, but a little less dominant than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. And in this next wave of vertical AI, there's an opportunity for that to continue to disperse and spread. So I think and if you again look at the history of America, each of the big technology waves have been centered in a few places, and then over time it distributes. So obviously, the financial services in this country was centered around Wall Street, New York City. Now, Forbright is in Maryland, or many other venture firms, private equity firms, hedge funds spread all around the country. 100 years ago, if you wanted to be in the entertainment industry, you kind of had to be in Hollywood. Still very strong, still important to that industry, just as New York is still important to financial services, but it's spread and dispersed more broadly. 100 years ago, the automobile was the hot technology of the day, not internet, not AI, but transportation technology. Detroit was the most important city in terms of innovation then, a fifth largest city in America, and the most important innovation hub in America. So you see, as technologies you kind of rise and fall, you see cities rise and fall. But the key is recognizing there is something to agglomeration. There's something to bringing talent and capital together, some clustering, if you will. But it's better for the country if instead of it just being one or two or three places, it's in several places or several dozen places. But it requires entrepreneurs to think that way. It requires investors to think that way, and it also requires policymakers to think that way, whether it be mayors or governors or folks in Congress. You were obviously a leader, and because you were an entrepreneur and bringing that entrepreneurial perspective, and some of the things that Congress passed, like the Jobs Act, other things were helpful. Opportunity zones were helpful in terms of dispersing more capital and more people in more places. So it's something that really requires a cross-sector effort to make sure that America continues to lead, and we do it in a way that brings along more people in more places.
Most people run business. Most people have the privilege of leading a business or running a business, aren't probably running one of these super successful, technology companies in Silicon Valley, right? They're running all kinds of businesses, as you said, all over the country: healthcare companies, financial services business, manufacturing businesses, all kinds of businesses. And I think everyone is wrestling with what's their AI strategy. How do they embed some of this innovation into their business? And you obviously were the founder and leader of one of the most iconic technology companies, but you've also invested in businesses very successfully that are not necessarily viewed as technology companies. Companies like CAVA, one of the most successful fast casual dining businesses in the United States. So how should business leaders or listeners here who are running companies, what's the mindset you think they need to adapt? They look at these tools and they say, wow, this can change my business in all kinds of ways. Lower costs, give me more opportunities, et cetera. But then they get concerned that they're falling behind. They might get disrupted. So what would be your advice to CEOs from kind of a mindset perspective as to how to think about all of this unfolding around them?
Be curious, get in front of the parade. The momentum is building. You don't want to be left behind. And, build a culture within your company of experimentation, rapid experimentation, trying different things. Some things might not work. You adjust and try different things. You got to get in the middle of it and really understand it. Some larger companies have done this successfully by building an ecosystem that supports startups, even having a little bit of a venture capital office within the company, partly to generate return, but also it's sort of almost like a seeing eye dog to understand what's going to happen next because you're talking to some of the innovators that are making those things happen. You've got to be imagining how your customers, whether it be consumers or businesses, whatever industry you're in, how their needs are likely going to change in the future, how new technologies, new business models, new partnerships, new policy, new whatever might change the game, and how do you get in front of that and benefit from that as opposed to be caught behind. I do think also the nature of the economy now and the industry is now getting disrupted. Sometimes there's a little too much focus on the technology. What I've always found in some of the companies you mentioned that we backed, they are usually using technology to reimagine how to do something in a particular kind of sector. But there's also innovation around the business model. There's a bunch of things going on. It's a multifaceted set of things that are shifting. And so, yes, the technology in of itself, you can look at and say, how is that going to change things? But how also 10 years from now might policy change things? What new partnerships could be formed that are big unlocks and that make things possible? One company we backed over a decade ago, for example, is a biometric technology company called Clear. They're best known for providing kind of fast pass access through airports. So the biometric technology was interesting, but the policy changes with the transportation agencies to allow private companies to provide security in the airport was a big unlock. And then forming partnerships with the airports and the airlines was a big unlock. So yes, it's biometric technology, but that's almost the table stakes. It's what they did around that, the other aspects. That's really what drove the value. Tempest, an AI company we backed in Chicago, again, about a decade ago, now a leader in using AI and genomics to diagnose disease. The core technology they built was really important, but the partnerships they formed, getting now almost all the National Cancer Institute hospitals providing their data and using that data to have this much more precise tool to analyze a situation and recommend a particular path. It was again not the technology per se. That was sort of the table stakes. It was the partnerships built around that. I think we're going to see much more of that in the future. It's not just what the technology enables; it's how your team can think about navigating a world where the policy is going to change. Some of the strategic partnership opportunities are going to evolve, and figuring out an overall strategy, a kind of integrated strategy to get in front of that and be able to lead the parade.
There's no shortcuts, in other words. I mean, we see that all the time when we see business plans. You do as well. And you look at some really good businesses and they overly try to position themselves as technology companies or AI companies because they think it's hot. And it's sometimes a glaring mistake they make because you feel like saying to them, you've got a really good business, you're using some great technology tools, and you're probably on the cutting edge, but you're fundamentally not a technology company, right? You're not an AI company. In the Clear is a technology company in a way, but we all know it from seeing it at the airport and using it at the airport. It's an amazing service, but it's so much more than that. It's a service provider, the way they deal with customers, other things they're looking at doing at stadiums. And you talked about public policy, and I know that's something that policymakers are wrestling with everywhere, at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level, although they're not doing much at the federal level. What should be some of the policies that would make sense to both protect people, some basic ways, things like privacy, et cetera, but also to ensure that the U.S., we started with the 250-year most extraordinary startup story ever, but to make sure, the next several decades and the next 250 years, it's hard to even think about that, are as successful. I mean, what, you sit at the intersection of entrepreneurship, investing, public policy. You were instrumental in getting the Jobs Act passed, which has really helped get more companies public. We were losing so many public companies. Now it's easier for companies to go public. So where do you think the policymakers really should be focusing, balancing all those things?
Yeah, it's tricky because I have seen, again, in the early days of the internet, I advocated for sort of a light touch because the internet was still pretty early. Not that many people were online, didn't quite know how it's going to develop, didn't really even know things like e-commerce, which, would take off. Of course, now, it's a big, huge sector, but in the early days, it was pretty fragile, maybe even a little bit questionable. So it's sort of like let it run for a little bit and then intervene when you have a little more clarity about how things are sorting out. And that worked well with the internet. In the early days, for example, with things like e-commerce, there was no taxation of e-commerce. Once it got scale, another 15, 20 years later, states then said, okay, now it's time to tax it. So I think that I saw the benefits of that kind of light touch approach. It's a little trickier though with AI because number one, the pace of which the adoption has happened, as I mentioned, we took a lot of years for the internet to take off. It took only a few months for AI, particularly consumer applications like ChatGPT, to take off. So you don't have the luxury of saying it's going to take 10 or 20 years for this to, got to be embraced by society. It's happening much more quickly. And I think Europe has probably, as is often the case, been a little too heavy-handed in terms of some of the AI policies, which likely will stifle innovation. But saying we should just let it rip. There's, the private sector should figure this out completely. I think probably is not the right approach either. One area specifically I've advocated for is I want to make sure that the AI isn't just an industry where big tech gets bigger, that startups do have an opportunity. So, the equivalent we saw with the internet of open access, in this case, open source, so the large platforms have to allow other smaller companies to work on their platforms. They're doing that now because they're fighting this battle for attention and market share and so forth. But often what's happened is platforms that start as open when it's competitive, once they establish a leadership position, start closing things down. You saw that with Twitter. You saw that with Facebook. We need to make sure the open platforms remain open, and as a result, you have more competition, and you're not just relying on the biggest companies, the biggest platforms, which has never been, in my opinion, the American way. We've always been kind of backing those upstarts, and again, many of them will fail, but some of them will emerge as the next great innovators and entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that's true in the sector like AI, even though capital requirements are significant. And you talked about the need to access data centers, other things are significant. It's harder for startups to get the funding they need to really be serious players in this sector. But we need to make sure that opportunity will continue to persist in the years to come.
Well, the nice thing about ending on that note is there's probably no more bipartisan topic than making sure we support startups. This was a great conversation, Steve. Thank you. I mean, 250 years, the most successful startup ever, lots of optimism for the future. Innovation has largely made the world better. Doesn't make it better for every person in every place at every moment in time. But it's hard to argue that the American-led innovation machine, which is really the way I think of our economy, has made the world a better place. So hopefully, some of our policymakers will listen to some of your advice and think about how to turn these forces in a way that benefit as many people as possible. So
I
thanks
agree,
for
and I appreciate your leadership on these issues, including when you're in Congress and now in the private sector. Because as you said, the issue of innovation, entrepreneurship, job creation, economic growth is one of the few bipartisan issues still. When we're traveling around the country doing our Rise the Rest bus tour, I wouldn't really know who the mayor or the governor or the senator is, whether Republican or Democrat, other than having read my briefing notes, because they're all talking the same
yeah.
language. And you saw that when you were in Congress. So this is a place that we can work together. This is a place that still kind of unites us. And so as we think about this next 250 years, let's make sure we don't lose sight of what got us to now and make sure we build on that so we have a brighter future.